Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, The Sheriff's Vow. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1, Dust and Shadows. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, but the heat of the day was already settling in, thick and heavy. The windswept streets of Tumbleweed Ridge lay in the grip of an early morning stillness, broken only by the occasional clink of a windmill creaking on the edge of town and the low murmur of the town's waking souls. Dust danced like spectres in the muted glow of dawn, swirling and rising from the cracked earth to coat the weathered wooden facades of the saloons, shops, and townhouses. It was a town of dust and grit, held together by the fragile thread of law and survival, where every man and woman carried the weight of the land on their shoulders. James McCall had seen it all. He sat tall in the saddle of his horse, watching the town slowly come to life with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to solitude. His dark eyes, sharp and observant, skimmed over the horizon, where the once vibrant sky began to pale into the soft blush of morning. The town looked as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something, or perhaps nothing at all. The sort of peace that only came before the storm. The sheriff's boots clacked softly against the worn boards of the main street as he guided his horse past the creaking saloons and empty storefronts. A few townfolk were already out, heading to their daily chores. The women in their faded dresses adjusted their aprons and cast him wary glances, while the men nodded grimly but said nothing. McCall's presence was known to all. A man of few words and even fewer friends, his reputation preceded him. He tipped his hat to old Mrs. Granger as she bent down to pick up a basket of eggs. Her wrinkled face cracked into a smile, the corners of her eyes tightening with the effort of it. "Morning, Sheriff," she muttered, not looking him directly in the eye. "Morning, ma'am," he replied, his voice low, barely more than a grunt. There was a quiet tension in the air today, a sense of anticipation that he couldn't shake. He had been patrolling the streets for years now, but today felt different, like the very dust beneath his boots was restless. It wasn't just the coming storm. It was the feeling that something was off, something dark swirling just out of reach. As the sun's first rays lit the edges of the town, a distant rumble of thunder echoed across the horizon, a warning perhaps of the trouble that always lurked in the corners of the frontier. Sheriff McCall's thoughts turned inward as he guided his horse toward the town's modest office. Duty, honor, it was what had kept him going these long years, long after others had given up on Tumbleweed Ridge. But there were days when it felt like the weight of that responsibility was more than he could bear. A flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe loneliness, crossed his mind as he reached for the reins. He reached down absent-mindedly, his fingers brushing against the inside of his vest. Tucked away inside, behind a small pocket, was a faded photograph. A younger woman, a face that had haunted his dreams for years. But that was a different time, a different life. A life that seemed as distant now as the wind howling in the canyon. James McCall was a man bound by his duty. And sometimes that duty made him long for a different fate, one without the shackles of responsibility of law. He could almost taste it, the freedom that might come if he simply walked away. But the sheriff didn't walk away. He never had. He couldn't. The low murmur of voices reached his ears as he rode past the general store. A group of men stood gathered around the porch, their faces tight with concern. McCall's eyes narrowed slightly as he passed, catching snippets of their conversation. "Unseasonable, you think?" one man muttered, his voice tight. "Strange happenings down by the river," another man replied, his voice just a little too quiet, like he didn't want anyone to overhear. "Nothing's right, Sheriff. Something's wrong here." McCall didn't stop to listen. There was always talk of something strange in a town like this. Tumbleweed Ridge had its share of trouble. But something about this felt different, like the air before a storm. The sun climbed higher, painting the town in shades of amber and gold. The sheriff rode past the old church, its bell silent, its doors tightly shut. It was always shut. A place of solace that had seen too many people come and go, but never enough of either. McCall had never been much of a man for faith. His belief was in the law, in doing what was right, no matter the cost. And yet, as he gazed across the open plains stretching toward the horizon, he could almost feel something stirring, a sense that the peace he had spent years trying to maintain was slipping from his grasp, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. McCall stopped his horse at the crest of a small hill that overlooked the town. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat, the sound of it whipping through the tall grass like the soft growl of a predator on the prowl. His hand drifted to the pocket of his vest once more, his fingers closing around the photograph. For a moment he let himself remember. And then just as quickly he shoved the memory away, focusing again on the horizon. The storm was coming. And this time it would bring more than just the wind. As the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, McCall's jaw tightened. He had sworn an oath to protect this town, to protect these people. But deep down, he feared that when the storm hit, it might be more than he could handle. Tumbleweed Ridge had always been a town of dust and shadows. But now, those shadows were growing longer. The midday sun cast a harsh, unforgiving light over Tumbleweed Ridge. The town square, normally a place of quiet exchanges and hasty transactions, had come alive with tension. A crowd had gathered, their voices rising in heated argument as the men shouted over one another, their faces flushed with anger and frustration. Dust swirled in the thick, dry air, coating everything in a film of brown that matched the color of the land itself. At the center of it all stood Celia Harper, her figure as unyielding as the ground beneath her boots. She faced down a group of local bullies men with broad shoulders, calloused hands, and the air of those accustomed to getting what they wanted. But Celia didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture firm, as she confronted their accusations with a dignity that seemed almost out of place in this chaotic, dusty corner of the world. "Miss Harper, you can't just claim this land as yours," one of the men sneered, his voice thick with the sound of someone used to having their way. His beady eyes narrowed as he glanced at the others, seeking their approval. "I've been living on this land long enough to know its worth," Celia replied, her voice steady, each word measured but unwavering. "And I'll not be bullied into giving it up." Her eyes, dark and defiant, locked onto his. She was a striking figure, not just because of her beauty, though she had that in abundance, but because of the strength that radiated from her. There was a quiet grace in the way she stood, even in the face of men who had no qualms about intimidation. Her dress, simple but neat, fluttered slightly in the breeze, revealing the long, dust-covered boots she wore. Her brown hair, tied back with a leather strap, caught the sun's rays, sending a halo of light around her face, softening the sharp lines of her jaw, yet doing nothing to diminish the resolve in her gaze. James McCall stood at the edge of the crowd, his dark eyes scanning the scene. He had come to the square for a simple patrol, but he couldn't help but be drawn into the commotion, his gaze fixed on the woman at the center of it. There was something about her, the way she held herself, unflinching in the face of the men around her, that stirred something in him. He watched her, the sharpness of her features softening in the light of the afternoon sun. There was an air about her, something that suggested she wasn't just a woman standing her ground over a piece of land. She was standing for something far greater than that, something James couldn't quite put his finger on, but something that stirred a strange and unsettling feeling deep in his chest. "You can't fight this alone, Miss Harper," another man chimed in, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "This town has its ways, and your little claim won't change a thing. You'd be better off leaving it to the professionals." Celia's lips tightened, and her voice, when it came, was like a blade in the air, sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I'd rather stand alone than bow to men who would sell their own mothers for a profit," she said, her voice cold with a bitterness that James could feel in his bones. "The land doesn't belong to anyone but those who honor it, and I will defend it with everything I have." Her words hung in the air, challenging, defiant. A murmur ran through the crowd, some men nodding in reluctant approval, while others shifted uncomfortably. The tension between Celia and the men grew palpable, but James remained rooted in place, watching as she faced them down with a strength he hadn't seen in many of the men he had known over the years. The wind stirred, lifting the dust from the ground and sending it swirling around them in a haze of light and shadow. It was in that moment that their eyes met across the crowd. James, standing like a silent sentinel at the outskirts, and Celia, standing in the center of the storm. His gaze, steady and intense, caught hers, and for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them. He saw something in her eyes then, a flicker of vulnerability beneath the defiance, something she hid so well beneath her armor. A quiet pain, perhaps, or a fear she had learned to bury beneath her sharp tongue and stubborn will. And yet, despite that, she stood her ground, unwavering. "Miss Harper," James called, his voice cutting through the tension of the square, his deep baritone carrying over the crowd. "Perhaps it's time to take a step back before this gets out of hand." Celia turned to him, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she took him in. Her mouth parted, but instead of a retort, she closed it again, studying the man who had intervened. Sheriff McCall, of course. The lawman who had earned a reputation for keeping things in line, no matter the cost. Her gaze swept over him quickly, taking in his dark, weathered features and the hard set of his jaw, the unflinching way he stood, like a mountain against the winds of the world. There was a wariness in her eyes as they met his, but also something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite name. "I'm not the one who needs to step back, Sheriff," she said, her voice cool but with a hint of something that James couldn't quite identify. "I'm simply standing for what's right, something that's sorely lacking around here." The words stung, but they didn't feel like an accusation so much as a challenge to his own moral code, perhaps, or to the world he had worked so hard to protect. James could feel the weight of her words pressing in on him. There was something in her that made him question what he had come to believe about justice and duty. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking over the crowd, which had quieted as the confrontation between the two of them took center stage. "You're right, Miss Harper," he said, his voice smooth, though his mind raced with the implications of her challenge. "But this isn't the way to handle it. There are ways to settle these matters without resorting to confrontation." Her lips curled slightly, the faintest of smiles flickering in her eyes before it vanished. "If the law had its way," she said, her words pointed and filled with a quiet fire, "we wouldn't be here, would we, Sheriff?" James's breath caught in his chest. The challenge in her voice was clear as the burning heat of the midday sun. He knew in that moment that their fates had been set on a collision course. "I'll remember that, Miss Harper," he said, his tone soft but carrying a weight that seemed to hang between them. "But I'll ask you again, take a step back." She tilted her chin, a spark of something indefinable flashing in her eyes, but she didn't back down. She simply turned away, her boots clicking against the ground, as she walked toward the edge of the crowd, leaving James standing there, his heart inexplicably heavy. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the moment lingered in the air like smoke, thick and lingering, and James couldn't shake the feeling that, for better or worse, their paths were now irrevocably tangled. And as he watched her walk away, he couldn't help but wonder what had drawn him to her, this woman, who stood against the world with a quiet strength that both intrigued and unsettled him. The storm that had been building in the distance felt suddenly closer, as if it were tied to this very moment. The sun beat down on Tumbleweed Ridge, its scorching rays casting the town in an unforgiving light. In the heart of the bustling square, a heated dispute raged. Men shouted, their voices rising like the crack of a whip, while women huddled in small, nervous groups, their eyes darting between the argument and the sky, where dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Celia Harper stood at the center of the storm. Her posture was rigid, resolute, unbending even as the men around her pressed in, their faces flushed with anger. The land she had staked her claim on, land that had been in her family for generations, was now the object of contention. The corrupt men of the town wanted it, and they would stop at nothing to seize it. "Don't you think you can stand in our way, Miss Harper?" one of the men growled, his voice thick with menace. "This land belongs to the town now. You're just a woman. What do you know of property and power?" Her lips curled, but there was no humor in the smile she gave him, only cold resolve. "I know enough to stand my ground, and I'll not let the likes of you bully me off what's mine." The words hung in the air, a challenge none of them could ignore. Despite their threats, Celia's presence, tall and unyielding, seemed to push back against the hot, dry wind that stirred the dust beneath their feet. She wasn't a woman accustomed to bending, not to anyone, least of all men like these. For a moment she stood still, facing them head-on, her face painted with defiance and something deeper, something that stirred something within the heart of the sheriff, who watched from the edge of the crowd. James McCall had been riding through town when the noise had caught his attention. A quick glance had drawn his eyes to the center of the square, and there she was, Celia Harper, the very image of a woman who refused to be intimidated, even by the roughest of men. Her voice, steady as a mountain stream, rang out over the noise, and though he had seen his fair share of feisty women on the frontier, something about the way she carried herself was different. There was a quiet strength in her that caught him off guard, and despite the anger swelling around them, he felt a strange pull to her, something in the way she fought for what she believed was hers. He gave a sharp tug on the reins of his horse, and with the motion, the crowd parted like water before a rock. His arrival was neither loud nor brash, just the steady approach of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Sheriff James McCall's reputation preceded him, and in the tense air of the town square, it was enough to still the crowd for a moment. "Everyone take a step back," he commanded in a voice as firm as the earth beneath them. His gaze flicked from the men surrounding Celia to the onlookers, and the murmur of voices quieted, their attention shifting to him. The men who had been advancing on Celia paused, glancing at each other and then back at the sheriff. They knew better than to challenge him directly. The sheriff was a man of duty, a man who didn't shy from making the tough calls. But even as they backed down, his gaze remained fixed on Celia. Their eyes met across the small stretch of dirt, and for the briefest of moments, the world seemed to fall away. The noise of the crowd dimmed, and all that was left was the space between them, charged with an unspoken understanding. Both of them stood in defiance of the world they had been given. Both carried the weight of things that could not be spoken aloud. In that instant, James truly saw her. Not just the woman fighting for her land, but the quiet fire in her eyes, the raw vulnerability masked by her fierce exterior. She was alone in a way he recognized all too well, standing against forces bigger than herself, yet refusing to yield. Something about her stirred him in a way he couldn't explain, a feeling that flickered like the heat of the midday sun, momentarily blinding him before settling deep inside him. Her gaze held his, unwavering, but there was something else there too, a recognition of sorts. Perhaps it was the shared loneliness, or the silent rebellion they both carried like shadows trailing behind them. She wasn't afraid of him, and she wasn't afraid of the men surrounding her either. But there was something in her eyes that hinted at the toll it had taken, something that made his chest tighten. The moment stretched, longer than it should have, but neither of them moved. The air crackled between them, the lingering tension giving way to something neither could ignore. Then, with a soft rustle of fabric, Celia broke the silence, her chin lifting just slightly in acknowledgement. Her lips, pressed into a thin line, softened for the briefest of moments, a gesture of respect, of thanks. Or perhaps something more, something that James didn't have the courage to name. The men who had been gathered around her seemed to come back to themselves, shifting uneasily as McCall's presence loomed over them. One by one, they turned and walked away, their heads bowed in reluctant submission. But even as they departed, the spark of defiance in Celia's eyes didn't fade. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of the confrontation fading as quickly as they had begun. The square grew quieter, but something had changed. The dust still hung in the air, but now it felt heavier, laden with the unspoken words between the sheriff and the woman who had fought so fiercely for what was hers. James remained in place, watching as Celia turned to leave, her back straight, her head high. Her boots clicked softly against the cobblestones, each step echoing in the silence that followed. For a long moment he stood there, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite grasp. There was something about her, something in the way she held herself, that unsettled him. She was not a woman he had expected to find in a place like Tumbleweed Ridge, yet here she was, standing her ground in the face of every force that sought to take what was hers. As she passed by him, just close enough for him to smell the faint scent of lavender carried by the wind, their eyes met once more. The briefest of glances, but in it he saw the same recognition, the same question. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of the battle fought and won, if only for now. "Sheriff," she murmured, her voice soft but strong, carrying a weight that seemed to hang between them. "Miss Harper," he replied, his voice low, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than it should. And just like that she was gone, disappearing into the distance as the crowd dissolved, leaving him standing in the square, alone with his thoughts. He knew then, without a doubt, that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that fate had already begun to weave its tangled web around them. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the vast stretch of the western sky a blanket of deep navy, speckled with countless stars. The air was cooler now, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to a soft, whispering breeze that stirred the tall grasses along the riverbank. It was a quiet peace, one that felt as though the land itself was taking a breath after the weariness of another long day. Celia Harper stood at the edge of the river, her boots sinking into the soft earth, her eyes fixed on the shimmering surface of the water as it caught the light of the stars above. She had come here to escape the noise of the town, to be alone with her thoughts for just a little while. The quiet of the night was a balm for her soul, soothing in its stillness, offering solace where the harsh, unyielding world of Tumbleweed Ridge could not. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she had learned to crave it over the years, to seek out these quiet moments when she could let her guard down and simply be. Away from the prying eyes, the demands, the constant struggle for survival here, by the river, she could let go of the burdens that weighed so heavily on her heart. Celia's thoughts wandered back to the land she had fought so fiercely to protect. Her family's homestead, the memories of a life once filled with laughter and warmth, now reduced to the cold, hard reality of legal battles and empty promises. She hadn't always been this way, so guarded, so wary. There had been a time when she had believed in the goodness of people, when she had trusted that hard work and perseverance would carry her through. But that was before the world had taken everything from her the way it always seemed to take. Her father's untimely death, the slow, agonizing decline of the ranch that had once been the pride of her family, and the loss of a future she had once believed in, shattered like glass under the weight of betrayal and greed. Her heart tightened as she thought of those days. Those were memories she kept locked away, safe from the light of day, for fear they would consume her. Yet they never truly left. They lingered, like the dust in the streets of Tumbleweed Ridge, always present, always choking her, but never enough to completely suffocate her. Her shoulders slumped slightly as she took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. She wasn't going to allow herself to wallow in the past. Not tonight. Not when there was still a fight left in her. She had learned that much life would not pause for her grief, and so she had learned to fight with every ounce of strength she had, even if it meant standing alone. The sound of hooves drew her from her reverie, and she turned to find a lone rider approaching from the shadows, a silhouette against the starlit sky. The soft rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves was the only sound to break the silence of the night. Celia's pulse quickened as the figure drew closer, and she instinctively took a step back, her hand brushing the hilt of the knife at her side. The rider's identity became clear when the horse's shadowy form took shape. It was James McCall, the sheriff of Tumbleweed Ridge. He rode with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to solitude, his broad shoulders set beneath the wide brim of his hat, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the glowing sky. As he drew closer, He slowed the horse to a gentle trot, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Celia straightened, her stance more defensive than it had been a moment ago. She wasn't sure what had drawn here, but she wasn't sure she wanted to know. There had already been enough chaos in her life recently. "Miss Harper," he called softly, his voice carrying over the stillness of the night. "Sheriff," she replied, her tone wary though not unkind. "I didn't expect to see you out here." "I could say the same," he responded with a slight nod, pulling the reins to bring his horse to a stop. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I needed to clear my head. I find it's easier to think when I'm not surrounded by people." Celia raised an eyebrow, the faintest flicker of amusement crossing her face. "I suppose that makes two of us," she said. She hadn't meant to sound as guarded as she did, but something about his presence made her uneasy. James dismounted with a fluid, practiced motion, the soft rustle of leather against his clothes punctuating the quiet. He stood there for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He had a way of observing things, people, situations that was almost unnerving. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gentle but carrying a weight of uncertainty, as if he weren't sure of the answer. Celia hesitated, then nodded. "It's a free world. I can't stop you." He gave her a half-smile, though there was something almost apologetic about it, as if he sensed her hesitation. He stepped toward her, his presence now filling the space between them like an unspoken invitation. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the quiet murmur of the river as it flowed gently by, the rustling of the trees overhead the only other sound. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. In fact, it felt right. The stillness of the night, the solitude they both shared, seemed to weave a bond between them, one neither of them had asked for, but both seemed to need. James finally broke the silence, his voice soft. "I've been thinking a lot about the way things are going in town," he said, his eyes focused on the river, though his words were meant for her. "There's a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. People are looking for someone to blame. I'm not sure what to make of it all." Celia took a slow breath, her gaze still fixed on the water, the glint of moonlight catching the surface like silver. "I know how that feels," she murmured. "When the world turns against you, when nothing makes sense anymore. You can't help but wonder if maybe there's something wrong with you, if you're the one who's out of place." James turned his head to look at her then, his expression softening. "You're not out of place, Celia," he said quietly. "You're doing the right thing, no matter what anyone else says." Her heart thudded in her chest at the sound of her name on his lips, and she stole a glance at him. His eyes were steady, and though his words were simple, there was a sincerity in them that made her want to believe him. For a moment she allowed herself to believe him. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing it for the right reasons," she said, her voice quieter now, the weight of her words heavier than she had intended. "If I'm fighting for the right things. It's hard not to feel like it's all just slipping away, like no matter how hard I try, I'll never be enough." James took a step closer, his boots sinking slightly into the earth as he moved. His eyes never left hers. "You're more than enough, Celia," he said with quiet conviction. "Sometimes fighting for what's right is all we can do, even when the odds are against us. But you don't have to do it alone." For the first time that night, Celia allowed herself to truly look at him, really look at him. There was something in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. Beneath the sheriff's badge, beneath the responsibility that clung to him like a second skin, there was a man who, like her, was fighting to keep some shred of decency, some sliver of hope in a world that seemed bent on tearing it all down. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she was overwhelmed with a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't fear, though she had plenty of that. It wasn't hope, though she wanted to believe in it. It was something else, something deep and quiet, like a promise whispered on the wind. James was right. She wasn't alone. Not tonight. Not while the stars above them watched in silence, their steady light a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a flicker of something good. Celia swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside of that quiet riverbank seemed far away, lost in the vastness of the sky above them, and for the first time in a long while, Celia felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. And she realized then, as she stood beside the man who had just offered her something she hadn't known she needed, that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The river's gentle murmur was the only sound that accompanied them as they stood in the peaceful solitude beneath the star-filled sky. The quiet of the night was a balm to Celia's weary heart, a momentary escape from the crushing weight of the life she had built, and the one she had lost. The cool evening air, carrying with it the earthy scent of the river and the whisper of wind through the trees, wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. James McCall stood beside her, no words needed between them for now. His presence was steady, like a rock in the river's flow, strong, silent, and unwavering. His broad shoulders, framed by the dark silhouette of the trees, seemed to carry the weight of more than just his badge. There was a quiet grief in the way he held himself, a tension beneath the surface that she could see, though he said little of it. Sometimes Celia began softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I wonder if it's worth it. All the fighting, all the losing. The endless struggle to hold on to what's mine." James turned his head toward her, his gaze steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. He said nothing for a moment, letting her words hang in the cool night air between them before he spoke. "I know that feeling," he replied quietly. "Sometimes it feels like the harder you fight, the more you lose. You hold on to something with both hands, but it slips through your fingers anyway. And the more you try to stop it, the worse it gets." Celia turned to face him fully now, her eyes searching his face in the dim light. There was something vulnerable in his eyes, something raw that mirrored her own struggles, an echo of the pain she had carried for so long. She hadn't expected to find that in a lawman, a man who was supposed to uphold the rules, no matter the cost. Yet here it was, in the quiet steadiness of his gaze. "Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" she asked softly, the question slipping out before she could think better of it. James looked up at the sky, his gaze lingering on the stars that stretched above them, as if seeking answers from the heavens. There was a long silence before he finally spoke, his voice rough, as though the words were difficult to find. "I used to," he said, the truth of it hanging between them like a fragile thread. "Before I became sheriff, before I knew what it would take to keep order, I thought the law was just a way of keeping things fair. But the more I saw, the more I realized sometimes fairness isn't enough. Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing." Celia nodded, understanding that quiet truth more than she had words to say. She had learned that lesson long ago, when life had robbed her of so much. The law had promised to protect her, but the law hadn't kept her father alive. The law hadn't kept the land from being stolen from under her feet. No, there were things far bigger than any law that bound them to a sense of right and wrong. "Do you ever wonder, Sheriff," Celia began, her voice low and contemplative, "if there's something beyond all of this? Something more than the fight, more than the struggle?" James's eyes met hers then, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. He stepped closer, the sound of his boots soft on the ground, and for a moment they were close enough that Celia could feel the warmth of his presence, the quiet strength he radiated. "I do," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I wonder if there's more to life than this, than the weight of duty. Sometimes I think it would be easier if I could just walk away from it all, leave the badge behind. But then I see people like you, like the ones I've sworn to protect, and I know that leaving wouldn't make a difference. I can't ignore the people who need me." Celia let out a soft breath, her heart aching for him in a way she hadn't expected. She hadn't expected to find herself sympathizing with the sheriff. But then she hadn't expected much of anything when it came to James McCall. Yet here she was, drawn to him in a way that was hard to explain, as if they were two sides of the same coin, each of them burdened by responsibilities they hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. "I suppose I understand," she murmured, her eyes lowering to the ground as the wind stirred the grass at her feet. "The land, it's all I have left. I don't know who I'd be without it, without this fight. Maybe I'm afraid of what I'd become if I let it go. So I keep pushing forward, even when I feel like it's all slipping away." James's gaze softened as he studied her, and there was something in his eyes then, a recognition, an understanding of the pain that lay beneath her defiance. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that was both tender and fleeting. The connection, brief as it was, sent a ripple of warmth through Celia, a spark of something new, something fragile, but undeniable. "You don't have to fight alone," James said, his voice low, full of something unspoken. "There's always a way forward, even when it feels like you're trapped." For a moment Celia simply stood there, the quiet weight of his words settling around her like the night itself. She had never expected to find understanding, much less comfort, in the presence of someone like James. And yet, in the stillness of the evening, as the stars overhead glimmered like distant promises, she couldn't help but believe him. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," she whispered, her voice softer now, as if she were speaking a truth she hadn't yet fully accepted. "But I want to believe that there's something better out there for both of us. Something beyond all of this, beyond the fight." James didn't answer right away, but the silence between them was full of unspoken understanding. For the first time in a long while, Celia allowed herself to imagine a different future one, where the weight of the past didn't dictate every step she took, where the law wasn't the only thing keeping her afloat. The night deepened around them, the stars shining brighter as the last traces of the day faded into darkness. James and Celia stood in the quiet, their shared silence a promise of something unspoken. There was no clear path before them, no easy answers. But in this moment, beneath the vast sky, they shared something more than the burdens of their past. They shared a quiet hope for something more. As the night lingered on, the faintest glimmer of dawn just beginning to stir in the east, their gazes met once more. The look they shared spoke volumes of dreams unspoken, of futures uncertain, and of a quiet promise that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if in approval of the promise they had made, however unspoken, to one another. The morning sun rose slowly over Tumbleweed Ridge, casting a soft light across the town's familiar streets. The air, crisp and cool in the early hours, held the scent of dry earth and fresh pine, but there was an unease that hung in the air, a tension that was impossible to ignore. The usual bustle of the town, merchants setting up their stalls, children chasing one another, women sweeping their porches, felt muted today, as if the town itself was holding its breath. James McCall, fresh from a restless night spent in the company of his thoughts, rode slowly down the main street. His eyes scanned the faces of the townsfolk, but something was different today. There was a quiet whispering in the air, a hushed murmur that seemed to ripple through the crowd, stoking the flames of something just beneath the surface. His gut tightened, and he spurred his horse onward, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. It wasn't until he reached the square that he understood why. There, standing at the center of the town, was a hastily posted public notice, its bold, scrawled letters glaring in the early morning light. "Murdered in cold blood, Dr. Percival Harrington. Suspect, Celia Harper." The words hit him like a punch to the chest, the shock of the accusation sending a wave of disbelief through him. He had known Dr. Harrington, the well-regarded archaeologist and financier who had recently been involved in some of the town's most lucrative land deals. He was not a man without enemies, but the accusation that Celia Harper of all people was responsible for his death was nothing short of absurd. The ink on the notice still glistened as the crowd began to form around it, their voices rising in a fevered debate. James dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He tried to make sense of the scene before him, but it was hard to focus. The crowd was growing louder, the air thick with accusations and questions. He could hear the familiar rumblings of suspicion, half-truths, and wild theories that seemed to spread like wildfire. "Did you hear? They say she was seen arguing with him the night before. Must been a lover's quarrel gone wrong. She's always been a little too fiery for her own good. They say she has a temper. I told you she was trouble. James's jaw tightened as he pushed his way toward the center of the square, his eyes scanning the crowd. There were people shouting angry, fearful faces that had no qualms about making their opinions known. The undercurrent of fear was palpable, and he could see the way the mob mentality was beginning to take root. The voices grew louder, the accusations more pointed. The town was quickly descending into chaos, and all it took was a spark to set it off. But even as the mob gathered, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His thoughts turned inward as he recalled his conversation with Celia the night before by the riverbank. He remembered the vulnerability he had seen in her eyes, the way she had spoken of the fight she was waging for her family's land. She had seemed resolute, but she had also been open in a way he hadn't expected. She had shown him a side of herself that few had seen, and he had believed every word she said. He would not believe that she was capable of murder. The crowd's voices reached a fever pitch, and James stepped forward, his authoritative voice cutting through the noise. Everyone quiet down. But the frenzy of whispers continued, undeterred. "Sheriff," a voice shouted from the crowd, "are you really going to stand by and let her get away with it? She killed him." A heavy silence fell over the square as every eye turned toward James. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, his mind racing. He was the sheriff. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law. And yet, his heart told him that something was terribly wrong. He had seen Celia face down threats before, but this accusation was different. He had never imagined something like this would happen. As the townsfolk waited for his response, James's mind raced. His duty was clear. He had to follow the law. He had to uphold order. And yet his gut told him that Celia was innocent. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had manipulated the situation, used her as a scapegoat for a crime she hadn't committed. Before he could respond, the sound of boots crunching on the dirt alerted him to the arrival of the town officials, their faces grim and set with purpose. They had been called by the power brokers behind this accusation, and James knew that they would move quickly to detain Celia, regardless of the truth. "Sheriff," one of them said, his voice clipped and formal, "we have orders to arrest Celia Harper for the murder of Dr. Percival Harrington. The evidence is clear." James's chest tightened as the official's words sank in. He had no doubt that the town officials were acting under pressure, manipulated by those who stood to gain the most from Harrington's death. The town's elites had long seen Celia as an obstacle, a woman who dared to stand in the way of their ambitions. And now they had found a way to take her down. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, two deputies stepped forward, their faces impassive. They reached for Celia, who had emerged from the crowd, her face pale and drawn. "Celia, please," James said, his voice softer now, a plea in his tone. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Celia met his gaze, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Her lips trembled, but she stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. "This is a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the accusation. "I didn't kill him." James's heart ached at the sight of her, the fear in her eyes a mirror of the fear in his own. But he had no choice. The law was the law, and he had sworn to uphold it no matter the cost. The deputies moved quickly, cuffing her wrists and pulling her away, and James could only watch as Celia was led through the crowd, the murmurs of the townsfolk rising once more. As she was taken away, James's mind spun with the painful irony of it all. His oath demanded he enforce the law, but his heart told him that Celia was innocent. There was no way he could have known for sure. But deep down, he knew that she was not the murderer. This was something darker, something far more sinister than a simple crime of passion. The sound of her footsteps faded as she was escorted to the jail, and James stood in the square, his thoughts racing. He had made a vow to protect this town, but now, as he watched Celia being led away, he realized that his duty was no longer just about the law. It was about protecting her, too. But how could he protect her when the town itself had already turned its back on her? As the last of the crowd dispersed, James stood alone in the square, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. The fight for justice was just beginning, and he wasn't sure if either of them were ready for what lay ahead. The silence of the sheriff's office was only broken by the occasional rustle of paper as James McCall pored over the pile of documents spread out before him. The lamplight cast a dim glow across the worn wood of his desk, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room like ghosts of the past. The small town of Tumbleweed Ridge, normally so full of noise and life, felt a million miles away as James sat alone in the quiet of his office, the weight of his duties pressing down on him with an almost suffocating force. He had been staring at the papers for hours, but they all seemed to blur together in his mind, the details becoming a jumbled mess of names, dates, and accusations. The murder of Dr. Percival Harrington had sent shockwaves through the town, but what troubled James the most wasn't the crime itself, it was the way everything had unfolded. The speed with which the town had turned against Celia Harper, the swift, almost predetermined assumption of her guilt, and the damning evidence that seemed to fit too perfectly into place. James frowned as his eyes flicked over the witness statements again. It wasn't that the people who had testified against Celia were lying, it was the way they had been guided, pushed towards certain conclusions. The whole thing stank of manipulation. But the more he scrutinized the evidence, the more he saw the cracks, small, almost imperceptible details that didn't quite add up. He picked up the handwritten statement of one of the townsfolk, a man named Garrett Wells, who claimed to have seen Celia near Harrington's cabin the night of the murder. The timing of his account was suspiciously precise, down to the exact minute Celia had allegedly been seen. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had known Garrett for years, and the man's recollection of events had never been so clear, so specific, especially when it came to something as chaotic as a late-night confrontation. James laid the paper down with a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face as he leaned back in his chair. The air in the office felt thick, suffocating. It wasn't just the case that was weighing on him. It was the growing sense of doubt that had begun to gnaw at him, the quiet realization that perhaps the system he had sworn to protect was not as infallible as he had once believed. He thought back to other cases where justice had seemed more like a game played by the powerful, where the truth had been buried under layers of lies and deceit. He had always been able to justify his actions, to tell himself that he was doing his best, that the law was a necessary force in a town like this. But now, with Celia's life hanging in the balance, he wasn't so sure anymore. His thoughts wandered to the conversation he'd had with her just days earlier by the riverbank. She had seemed so genuine, so certain of her innocence. She had opened up to him in a way no one else had, and he had believed her. But now, as he sat alone in the dim light of his office, those doubts began to creep in, curling around the edges of his mind like smoke. He could still hear her voice in his ears, the quiet desperation in her tone when she had told him she hadn't killed Harrington. "This is a mistake," she had whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I didn't do it." James closed his eyes, the weight of his own conflicted emotions pressing down on him. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law. He had sworn to protect the people of this town. But what if the law wasn't protecting them? What if it was just another tool in the hands of the corrupt, a system built to benefit those who had the power to bend it to their will? He had spent years enforcing the law, trusting that it was the right thing to do, even when it meant making difficult decisions. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. The pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered in front of him, but they didn't fit. There were too many inconsistencies, too many gaps in the story. And Celia, with her fiery spirit and her quiet vulnerability, didn't fit the image of a murderer. James stood abruptly, pacing across the small office. His boots clicked against the wooden floor, the rhythmic sound a steady beat in the otherwise silent room. The questions weighed heavily on his mind. What had really happened the night of Harrington's death? And why was Celia being blamed for it? He thought back to his years on the force, the cases he had worked, the decisions he had made. He had always done what he thought was right. But had he really? Had he ever really questioned the way things were? Had he ever stopped to consider that the law was just another tool in the hands of the powerful? His gaze shifted to the window, where the pale light of the moon filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. He thought of Celia again, of her strength, her determination to fight for what was hers, even when the odds were stacked against her. And he thought of the law, something he had once believed in so completely, so unwaveringly. But now, standing here, alone in the quiet of the night, he realized something. The law wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. Not when it was so easily manipulated, so easily twisted to serve those in power. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but one thing was clear: he could no longer stand by and watch as an innocent woman was destroyed by a corrupt system. James McCall knew what he had to do. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain: he could no longer follow the path that had been laid out for him. He had to find the truth, no matter the cost. His fingers brushed over the documents once more, but this time he was no longer just reading the words. He was searching for something, anything that would give him the answers he needed. His mind was made up. There was no turning back. With a deep breath, James stood and grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. The night outside was waiting for him, and so was the fight that would define his future. The sun was beginning to set over Tumbleweed Ridge, casting long shadows over the town's quiet streets. The heat of the day was beginning to fade, but the tension in the air felt suffocating. James McCall sat in his office, the same papers from the previous night spread out in front of him. His mind raced as he sifted through the evidence again, trying to make sense of the jumbled mess of facts, witness statements, and contradictions. He had spent the last several hours in this small, dimly lit room, but the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. A knock on the door broke the silence. James didn't look up, his mind too far from the present to register the interruption. "Sheriff." A voice came from the doorframe, rough around the edges but warm, with the kind of familiarity only years of friendship could cultivate. It was Tom, his deputy. "You got a minute?" James rubbed his forehead, the lines on his face deepening. He didn't need a minute. He needed a way out of the storm that was brewing in his mind. But there was no escaping it. He pushed the papers aside and waved Tom in. "Yeah, come on in, Tom," James said, his voice sounding far more weary than he intended. Tom entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. He looked at James for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You look like hell, James." James gave a dry chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. He gestured to the stack of papers on the desk. "Just trying to make sense of all this." Tom's gaze flicked to the papers, then back to James, a knowing expression crossing his face. "I figured as much. You've been holed up here for days. Haven't seen you around the square. Not like you to be missing out on the daily gossip." James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "The gossip's the least of my concerns right now, Tom." Tom stepped further into the room and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "It's Celia, isn't it?" James didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The woman's name was like a stone in his gut, heavy and painful. He had spent the last few days trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than the accusations against her. His mind couldn't let go of the conviction that Celia was innocent, but the law was clear. The evidence, however flawed it felt, was damning. "Yeah," James muttered, his voice tight. "It's Celia." Tom's brow furrowed. He'd known James for long enough to see when something was eating at him. The sheriff had always been a man of quiet conviction, his sense of duty unshakable. But something had changed in the way James held himself. Tom could see the cracks forming, and he wasn't sure what would happen if James fell through them. "You're getting too emotionally involved, James," Tom said, his voice low but firm. James's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Tom's. "I'm not getting emotionally involved. I'm trying to make sense of it all. You're too close to this. Tom continued, his voice quieter now. "I've seen it before with other cases. You let your heart lead you, and you end up making a mistake you can't take back." James opened his mouth to argue, but Tom held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not saying you're wrong. Hell, I've got my own suspicions about this whole thing. But you've got to step back, James. You're the sheriff. You've got a duty to this town, to the law. The law isn't about what you feel, it's about what's just." James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I know what the law says, Tom, but this doesn't feel right. Celia didn't kill him. I don't believe it." Tom's eyes softened, a mix of concern and something deeper in his gaze. "I don't know what happened, James. I don't. But I do know that the powers that be in this town have a way of getting what they want. And I've got a feeling that this case is no different. You're not the first sheriff who's been pushed into a corner by the folks in charge." James's pulse quickened at Tom's words. It wasn't the first time he'd heard whispers of corruption in the town's leadership, but it had always been easy to dismiss them. After all, he had always done his best to uphold the law, no matter the cost. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little control he had over the forces at play here. "They've got their hands all over this," James said, his voice thick with frustration. "Everything about this feels wrong, how fast they moved to accuse her, how quick they were to drag her name through the mud. Hell, even the evidence, it doesn't add up. But no one's questioning it." "You're damn right no one's questioning it," Tom replied, his voice dark. "And that's exactly what I'm worried about. They don't want the truth. They want a scapegoat. Someone to take the fall while they keep making their money. And the law doesn't stand a chance against the ones who pull the strings." James ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning with the implications. "So what am I supposed to do, Tom? Just let her rot in jail while they get away with it?" Tom's voice softened. "I'm not saying you should ignore what you believe, James. I'm saying you need to be careful. You can't fight this fight with your heart alone. You've got to find the truth, but you've got to do it by the book. If you don't, you're no better than the ones you're fighting against." James turned away, his gaze falling to the stack of papers on his desk. His fingers hovered over them, trembling with the weight of the decision that lay before him. The law was clear, but his heart told him something different. His gut told him that Celia was innocent, that she was being used as a pawn in a much larger game. "You're right," James said, his voice quiet. "I know you're right, but it feels like everything I've believed in is breaking apart." Tom's voice was gentle now, a note of understanding in his tone. "I know, James. I know. But the truth will come out. It always does. You just have to be patient. You've got the law on your side, but sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you have to look beyond the system to see what's really going on." James nodded slowly, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had always trusted the law, had always believed in its power to bring justice. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure that it was enough. There were too many cracks in the system, too many hands pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He turned to face Tom, his expression hardening with resolve. "I'll find the truth, Tom, one way or another." Tom gave him a measured look, his voice low but steady. "I hope you do, James. For all our sakes." As the door creaked shut behind Tom, James stood alone in the fading light of his office, the weight of the decision before him clearer than ever. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: he could no longer follow the law blindly. He had to trust his instincts, no matter where they led him. And with that thought, he took the first step into a fight that would change everything. The office was cloaked in shadows as the dim light of a flickering oil lamp cast uneven glows across the walls. Outside, the town was settling into the kind of stillness that only the deepening night could bring. Tumbleweed Ridge seemed peaceful from a distance, but to James McCall, it felt like a fragile, veneer a town held together by the illusion of order and justice. James sat behind his desk, his elbows resting heavily on the wooden surface, his fingers steepled before him. The papers he had reviewed for the past few hours lay scattered around him, each one more damning than the last. Yet, with each document, a growing unease settled in his gut. His gaze shifted between the papers and the empty space of the room, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. His thoughts returned to Celia. The memory of her eyes wide with disbelief, yet firm with a quiet, unspoken strength, kept flashing in his mind. He could still see her standing there in the jail cell, the weight of the accusation upon her, her hands bound and her spirit unbroken. She had looked at him, not as a sheriff or a man of the law, but as someone who had chosen to trust her, and she had been vulnerable in a way that was rare for her. She didn't do it, he thought again, his heart heavy with the knowledge he could not ignore. I don't believe she did. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk as a flood of memories washed over him. His oath, his duty, his trust in the law. All his life he had believed in it. He had believed that justice could be upheld, no matter the cost. The law was the law. It was unyielding, and it was meant to be fair. But now, sitting here in the silence of his office, the questions echoed in his mind, louder than the steady ticking of the clock. Was the law really fair? Could it be trusted when it so easily fell into the hands of those who sought to manipulate it? Celia had been arrested before any investigation had even begun, her fate sealed by the whispers of the town's elite, her name sullied in public before she had the chance to speak her truth. His thoughts turned again to her arrest, the faces of the townspeople who had gathered in the square, each one quick to point a finger, quick to lay blame without so much as a whisper of doubt. The law had failed her. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, as the weight of his decisions pressed upon him. He had sworn to protect this town, to serve the law, to bring justice where it was due. But what if the law itself was broken? What if the very system he had pledged to uphold was being used as a tool to oppress those who had no power? The flickering light from the lamp cast shadows across his desk, and for a moment the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. His mind kept circling back to Celia's face, the way her eyes had held the truth even when no one else believed it. The conviction in her voice when she had told him she didn't kill Dr. Harrington. She was telling the truth. And yet, the system he had always trusted had chosen to ignore it, to sweep it aside in favor of something darker, something far more sinister. What kind of justice is this? He stared out the window, the moonlight casting pale beams across the dusty street. In the distance, he could hear the soft clatter of hooves on the road and the faint murmur of the night wind. The town seemed so still, so quiet. But beneath the surface, James could feel the rising tension, the fear that had begun to take root in the hearts of the people. They were waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next move in a game they did not fully understand. But James understood. He had seen enough to know the stakes, to feel the injustice closing in around him like a trap. And for the first time, he realized that if he was going to make a difference, he had to break free from the confines of his oath, from the rules that had always defined him. The internal battle raged within him as he stood, his boots scraping against the floor as he crossed the room. He looked at the pile of papers again, the testimonies, the statements, the flawed evidence, and he made a decision. He would investigate. He had no choice. Celia deserved the truth. Tumbleweed Ridge deserved the truth. And even if it meant stepping outside the law he had sworn to uphold, James knew it was the only way to make things right. The system had failed, and if he didn't take matters into his own hands, then who would? He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew the consequences of defying the established order. He had seen men before, good men, who had lost everything by going against the grain. But this was different. This wasn't about ambition or greed. This was about a woman's life, about the truth that was buried beneath a mountain of lies. The fire inside him grew brighter with each passing second, the resolve forming in his chest like a stone. "I'll find the truth, Celia," he muttered under his breath, his voice thick with determination. "No matter what it takes." He turned back toward the desk, gathering the papers with a sense of purpose. He would uncover the truth, piece by piece, even if it meant bending the rules he had always lived by. The law had failed her. But James McCall wasn't going to fail her, not when it mattered most. As he made his way toward the door, he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob. The weight of his decision hung in the air like the oppressive heat of a coming storm, but James didn't falter. Tonight he would take the first steps toward challenging the system that had failed them both. With one final glance at the quiet town, he stepped into the night, the door clicking shut behind him as the darkness swallowed him whole. The fight for truth had just begun. The tavern was cloaked in darkness, the flickering light from a solitary lantern casting long shadows against the weathered walls. The faint scent of stale beer and the low murmur of hushed voices filled the air. It was the kind of place where secrets were exchanged, where deals were struck in the dimmest corners, away from the prying eyes of the law. James McCall had never liked places like this. He had spent most of his life upholding order, keeping the peace in the light of day, where things could be seen for what they truly were. But tonight, the shadows seemed to draw him in, as if the very darkness of the room was calling him to a truth he had long ignored. He sat at a small, rickety table near the back of the tavern, his hands folded in front of him, the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on his chest. The men he had come to meet were no strangers. They were a mixture of old allies, some whom he had known in passing, others who had crossed his path in less formal ways. They were disillusioned locals, people who had lived under the thumb of the town's elite for years, watching the corrupt powers tighten their grip on everything they had fought for. They were men and women who had their own reasons to hate the establishment, and now, for better or worse, they had become his allies in this fight. A voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. Sheriff McCall. The speaker's voice was low, measured, and barely audible above the distant sounds of the saloon. It belonged to Hank, a former lawman with a sharp mind and a hardened soul. He was one of the few men in town who had seen enough of the system's failings to know when it was time to stop pretending. Hank leaned over the table, his face half hidden in the shadows, his eyes sharp. "You're sure you want to do this?" James met his gaze, his expression hardening. "You know why I'm here, Hank. I'm not turning back now." Hank studied him for a long moment, then nodded, though his face remained etched with worry. "The game's bigger than Celia, James. You're stepping into murky waters. And once you're in, there's no coming back." The words felt like a weight settling on his shoulders, but James didn't flinch. He had already stepped into those waters the moment he had decided to pursue the truth behind Celia's arrest. She hadn't killed Harrington, and he was going to prove it no matter what it took. Another man, thin and nervous, slid into the chair across from James. His name was Riley, a quiet informant spent more time in the shadows than in the light. He was the one who had seen the dealings between the town's elite and the so-called murder evidence. He had a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye, but tonight his usual bravado was replaced by a visible unease. "I've got what you need, Sheriff," Riley whispered, glancing around the room nervously as if expecting someone to overhear. His eyes darted to the door, then back to James. "The thing is, the evidence against Celia. It's all manufactured. The whole damn thing. Every last word of it." James's heart skipped a beat, but he remained outwardly calm. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Riley's lips made the truth feel even heavier. "How do you know?" Riley leaned closer, his breath quickening. "I've seen the documents. The ones the town's officials don't want anyone else to see. They've been planting false evidence, Sheriff. Framing Celia. And Harrington, he wasn't the saint they made him out to be. Hell, he was one of the worst of them, working in the shadows with those who control this town." A surge of anger shot through James, but he forced it down. He had suspected corruption in the town for years, but hearing it laid bare was different. His jaw tightened. "And you have proof of this. I've got enough to make it stick, but you've got to move fast. Once the elites in this town get wind of what I'm doing, they'll bury it. Hell, they'll bury you too, Sheriff." The warning hung in the air, and for a moment, James felt the full weight of his decision. This wasn't just about Celia anymore. This was about something far bigger, something that ran deep beneath the surface of Tumbleweed Ridge, where power and greed festered in the dark corners. He straightened, his hands balling into fists. "I'll take it. Whatever you've got, Riley. I'll expose them." Riley nodded, but his eyes were filled with something James couldn't quite read. Fear? Or was it something else? Whatever it was, it didn't matter. Not anymore. As the meeting wrapped up, and the men slipped away into the night like ghosts, James lingered in the dim light of the tavern, his mind racing with the gravity of the situation. He had the proof, now the evidence, to clear Celia's name and expose the corrupt underbelly of the town. But he also knew that what lay ahead would require more than just courage. It would demand a sacrifice, a part of him he wasn't sure he was ready to lose. James pushed through the saloon doors, stepping out into the cool night air. The sky above was deep and vast, a blanket of stars stretched wide over the small town. But for James, the stars didn't offer any comfort tonight. The darkness seemed to match the turmoil inside him. His hands shook as he reached for his badge, pulling it from his chest. The weight of it, once a symbol of his unwavering duty, now felt heavy and foreign. He stared at the tarnished silver for a long moment, memories of his oath swirling in his mind. The badge had meant something to him, once something he could believe in. But now it felt like a symbol of the very system that had failed him. Failed Celia. Failed the people he had sworn to protect. His hand clenched around it, the metal cold against his skin. The thought of letting go, of stepping away from everything he had built, flashed in his mind. But could he? Could he abandon the very thing he had given his life to? His gaze lifted to the horizon, the faint glow of the town's lights, just barely visible in the distance. The law was no longer enough. He could feel it in his bones. There were cracks in it, deep ones, that ran all the way to the core of Tumbleweed Ridge. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized that Celia wasn't the only one being buried by the system. With a heavy sigh, James slipped the badge back into his pocket, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. There was no turning back now. Tomorrow he would fight for the truth. But tonight he was already in the murky waters of corruption, and the journey ahead would demand more from him than he had ever given before. The path had been set, and James McCall was no longer sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain: the law was no longer the answer. Only the truth could save them now. The chill of the night air bit at James as he walked through the shadowed streets of Tumbleweed Ridge, his footsteps muffled by the dust that clung to the earth. The sky above was thick with stars, but their light did little to ease the heaviness in his chest. The weight of his decision gnawed at him. He was slipping into a world he had sworn never to enter. But the truth had become his obsession, and he knew no other path forward. Earlier, Riley had slipped him the evidence, disjointed notes and scribbled papers that had already begun to pull the threads of the conspiracy tighter around him. The more he uncovered, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. There were those in this town who would stop at nothing to maintain control, and Celia's innocence was nothing more than a casualty in their war for power. James had been careful in his investigation, staying under the radar as much as possible. But tonight he had received an unexpected summons, a meeting with a figure he had hoped never to cross paths with. The streetlights cast long shadows as James reached the alley behind the saloon. His instincts, honed over years of law enforcement, told him to be wary, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. The man who had contacted him had been vague in his message, but the urgency in the note had been clear. "Meet me tonight. I have what you need to take them down." James had considered refusing the meeting, but the promise of answers, of more pieces to the puzzle, had driven him forward. He had no choice now but to see it through. As he turned the corner, a figure emerged from the darkness. The man was tall, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and his coat hung loosely around him, as if he were trying to blend into the shadows. There was a dangerous air about him, but James could sense something else beneath the surface, a calculating mind, and a sharp awareness that made him dangerous in ways James could not fully grasp. The man stepped forward slowly, his boots clicking softly against the cobblestone. "Sheriff McCall," he said in a voice that was smooth but edged with something darker. "I'm glad you came." James didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the man's intentions. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease beginning to settle in his gut. The man's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Someone who's tired of watching the town drown in its own lies," he said, his gaze flicking over James with a mix of amusement and calculation. "And someone who thinks you might be the key to putting an end to it." James felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "What do you know about Celia?" he asked, his voice hardening. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to reveal. "I know she's being framed. I know there are people in this town who want her out of the way. But I also know that she's not the only one in danger. You're in this now, Sheriff. Whether you like it or not." James's heart skipped a beat. The man's words struck a nerve, but James refused to let his emotions show. He had learned long ago that people like this man didn't deal in kindness or honesty. Everything came at a price, and he wasn't sure he was willing to pay it. "What do you want from me?" James asked, his voice low but firm. The man's smile widened, and he took a step closer. "I want you to listen carefully, Sheriff. I can give you the names, the evidence, and the power you need to bring the truth to light. But you have to understand something if you take this path. There's no going back. You'll be stepping into a world where the law doesn't always apply, where morality is blurred, and where the consequences of your actions may be more than you're willing to bear." James felt a shiver run through him. It was a warning, a subtle threat disguised as advice, but the offer was tempting, too tempting to ignore. The law had already failed Celia, and it had failed the people of this town. Could he truly stand by and watch as the truth was buried beneath more lies? "I'm not interested in doing things outside the law," James replied, his voice steady but his mind racing. "I've worked hard to uphold the law in this town, and I'm not about to abandon it now." The man chuckled softly, a low, humorless sound. "The law doesn't always work the way it's supposed to, Sheriff. Sometimes the right thing isn't the legal thing. Sometimes justice requires stepping outside the rules to make things right. You've seen the evidence, haven't you? You've seen how Celia is being used as a pawn in a game that's bigger than her, bigger than any of us. You've got the chance to fix it if you're willing to bend the rules a little." James's fingers twitched at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. He had sworn an oath to uphold justice, but the corruption around him made that oath feel hollow. He had seen the cracks in the law, the way it was manipulated by those with money and power. The truth had become a commodity, one that was bought and sold at the highest bidder's will. "Why should I trust you?" James asked, his voice rough, the question hanging between them like an unspoken challenge. The man's smile faded, and his eyes gleamed with a knowing darkness. "Because, Sheriff, you don't have much of a choice. You either take my hand and play this game, or you watch as your town is swallowed whole by the very corruption you swore to fight." The words settled in the air like a thick fog, and James felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. His heart ached for the woman who had been falsely accused, for the justice he knew was slipping further and further from his grasp. But was he willing to cross a line he could never return from? Was he ready to bend the law for what he believed was right? The man took a step back, as if sensing the shift in James's mind. "Think about it, Sheriff. You're not as alone in this as you think. You're just one step away from everything you need to end this. But that step will cost you. And I don't think you're ready to pay that price." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving James standing in the alley, the weight of his decision hanging heavily on his shoulders. The world around him felt different now, darker, more dangerous. As the man's words echoed in his mind, James was left with a growing sense of dread, and yet a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. But at what cost? The path ahead was uncertain, and James was no longer sure where it would lead. But one thing was clear: he was no longer standing in the light. He had crossed into a world where morality was grey, where every choice he made would chip away at the man he once was. As he walked back toward the sheriff's office, the weight of the badge in his pocket felt heavier than it ever had before. He was no longer sure whether it was a symbol of justice or a reminder of the man he was becoming. And as the door to his office creaked open, James knew that his journey into the shadows had only just begun. Act 2. Uncovering the Web. The night was unusually still, save for the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures stirring beneath the moonlit sky. The world felt suspended in time, as though holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The dim glow of the crescent moon bathed the land in silver, casting long, eerie shadows over the sprawling grounds of the mansion ahead. James McCall crouched low behind a thick hedge, the rough edges of the shrub scratching at his coat as he adjusted his position. His breath was shallow, measured, each movement calculated to avoid detection. His heart hammered in his chest, the tension in the air making every nerve feel stretched to the breaking point. He had spent weeks gathering scraps of information, following whispered rumors, and now, here he was, closer to the truth than he had ever been. The mansion loomed before him, its grand architecture obscured by the darkness, but James knew it well. It belonged to a notorious landowner named Sir Julian Blake, a man with ties to every crooked deal in Tumbleweed Ridge. Blake was one of the key figures in the town's corrupt network, an affable face in public, but one who had the blood of countless deals soaked into his hands. He was a man who thrived on secrecy, on deals made in the dark, and James was about to see exactly how deep the rot ran. As he peered through the overgrown foliage, his gaze fixed on the mansion's front door, waiting. The stillness of the night made every sound feel amplified, and James strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement. He knew something was happening tonight, something important. He had followed Blake's movements for days, and now, as the hour grew late, he was finally going to uncover the truth. A carriage pulled up to the front of the mansion, its wheels creaking under the weight of its cargo. Two figures stepped down, their faces obscured by the shadows, but the glint of moonlight caught the edges of their coats, and James's instincts told him they were not ordinary guests. They were men of power, their movements deliberate, their steps confident as they walked toward the grand doors of the mansion. James's pulse quickened. This was it. The meeting was about to begin. He crouched lower, blending further into the foliage, trying to make himself as invisible as the night itself. His mind raced as he thought of Celia, the woman who had trusted him, the woman whose life was hanging in the balance. If he could just find the evidence, if he could just prove that Celia was being framed, that the people in power had orchestrated her downfall, he could set things right. The sound of muffled voices drifted toward him as the front door to the mansion opened, and the two figures were ushered inside. James's gaze followed them, noting every detail. His fingers itched for the evidence he knew would be waiting. It wasn't long before he saw the first signs of movement again. Figures started to trickle into the mansion, powerful men and women with faces James recognized from the town's elite. He kept his head low, careful not to make a sound as he observed, noting the way they greeted one another with subtle nods, their voices lowered in hushed tones. There was something about the way they moved too practiced, too guarded. Then, at the far side of the mansion's front yard, a man appeared from the shadows. James's eyes narrowed as he recognized him. It was none other than the town's mayor, a man who had never been shy about his ties to Blake. He exchanged quick, clipped words with the others before handing over a small leather pouch to one of the figures. The man accepted it with a curt nod, slipping it into his coat pocket. James's stomach dropped as the gravity of what he was witnessing settled over him. It wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, a plot that had been months, perhaps years, in the making. The pieces were falling into place now, and it was becoming clearer by the second Celia's arrest wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated maneuver, a pawn being moved in a much larger game. His gaze flicked back to the mayor, who was now shaking hands with Sir Julian Blake. The exchange between them was swift and businesslike, but the handshake lingered just a moment too long. There was something unsaid in that gesture, something that felt like a final agreement. A deal had been struck, Celia's fate sealed by the men who held power in Tumbleweed Ridge. James's blood ran cold. He had suspected something was wrong, but seeing the evidence in front of him made the situation all too real. He had been right. Celia had been framed, and the people in this town, the ones who controlled everything, were responsible. He felt the sting of betrayal deep in his chest. They were using the law as a weapon, manipulating it to suit their own needs, and it was up to him to stop them. But as the last of the conspirators slipped into the mansion, James hesitated. He had what he needed. He had seen the evidence of their dealings. He knew that Celia's arrest was nothing more than a pawn in a game of power and greed. But in that moment, the truth seemed too dangerous to hold. There were those who would stop at nothing to protect the lies they had built, and James could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to act quickly, but he also knew that once he made his move, there would be no turning back. He turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest, but just as he took a step, he heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The conspirators were coming. James retreated into the shadows, his heart hammering as he pressed himself against the rough stone wall of the mansion. He clutched the small leather pouch in his hand, the evidence he had gathered, the key to exposing the corruption in Tumbleweed Ridge, and listened, the footsteps growing closer. As the figures passed by, James's muscles tensed, and he held his breath, praying they didn't notice him. They were too busy talking amongst themselves to notice his presence, and soon they had passed. His chest heaved with relief, but the danger wasn't over. He needed to get out of there, and quickly. With a last, careful glance over his shoulder, James slipped deeper into the shadows, clutching the evidence tightly in his hand. He had seen enough. Now he had to take it back to town to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As he mounted his horse and rode away under the cover of darkness, the weight of what he had witnessed settled heavily on his shoulders. The truth was out there now, but bringing it to light would come with a price he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. But one thing was certain, there was no going back now. He was already in too deep. And as the road stretched out before him, James McCall knew that his journey was just beginning. The wind howled through the trees as James McCall rode his horse along the narrow, rocky path leading to the cabin. The landscape around him was wild and untamed, just as the men and women who had become his allies. They were all outcasts in their own ways, men and women who had seen enough of the town's corruption to know that change was needed, even if it meant sacrificing their own futures. The cabin was small and weathered, nestled on the outskirts of Tumbleweed Ridge, far from the watchful eyes of the town's elite. The kind of place that had always represented freedom from the power structures that had long held the town in their grip. James had always thought of himself as a man of duty, bound by the law, but he had long since realized that there were truths the law could not reach, truths buried too deep for any badge to uncover. As he dismounted and approached the cabin, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on his chest. He had made his decision. The law had failed Celia, and it had failed the people of Tumbleweed Ridge. Now he would stand with those willing to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit, the flickering glow of a fire casting long shadows on the walls. At a worn table in the center of the room sat his allies, 3 people who had chosen to risk everything to bring the truth to light. Hank, the ex-lawman, was the first to stand as James entered. His eyes were hard, the years of betrayal and disillusionment written on his weathered face. "Sheriff," he said in his low, gravelly voice, "you've made the right choice." Beside him sat Tom, James's loyal deputy. His face was grim, his usual sense of quiet determination now tinged with anger. Tom had always believed in the system, had always been the first to stand by James's side, but even he had begun to see the cracks. And now they were about to tear everything down. In the far corner of the cabin, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was Riley, the informant. The man who had once served the elite, now a broken and bitter figure who had learned the cost of betrayal. His sharp eyes met James's, and the briefest flicker of something unspoken passed between them. They were all here for one reason: to stop the corruption that had taken root in Tumbleweed Ridge, to free Celia, and to dismantle the web of lies spun by the town's most powerful figures. James took a seat at the table, his eyes sweeping over the group. "We all know what we're up against," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision he had made. "Celia didn't kill Dr. Harrington. We've seen the evidence. It's all been planted, and I'm certain that Blake and the others are behind it. But this isn't just about one murder, it's about a system that's been broken for far too long." Tom leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We've all known it for years, Sheriff. We've all seen the way the elite have manipulated the law to suit their needs. The ones who hold the power they never lose. Not when it counts." Hank nodded, his hands resting on the table, his eyes dark with the weight of years of serving the corrupt system. "The law's been twisted to protect the ones who break it," he said. "I've seen enough to know that what we've been doing isn't justice, it's just keeping the balance for the ones in charge. But now we have a chance to do something real, to take it all down." Riley shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking between the others. "I know how this game works. I've seen it up close. They'll do whatever it takes to silence us. But there's a way to beat them if we're careful. If we move fast." James leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together as he considered the weight of the moment. The idea of breaking the law, of going against everything he had sworn to uphold, sent a chill down his spine. But he knew it was the only way to make things right. There was no choice. "We'll need to move carefully," he said, his voice steady despite the internal turmoil that roiled within him. "We have one shot at this. If we act too quickly, we'll be exposed. We have to take down Blake, the mayor, and anyone else involved. We have to prove that they manipulated the evidence against Celia." Tom nodded grimly. "We'll do whatever it takes, Sheriff. But we have to be careful. We can't let them know what we're doing until it's too late for them to stop us." James turned to Hank. "What do you think?" Hank's eyes were hard, his voice low. "It's risky, but it's the only shot we've got. We're outnumbered and outgunned, but we've got one thing they don't each other. And we've got something else, too. The truth." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth it offered seemed distant compared to the heat of their mission. The world they were about to enter was dangerous and uncertain, but it was the only chance they had to set things right. James's eyes scanned the maps and documents that had been laid out across the table. He knew the risks. He knew what it would cost them physically, emotionally, and morally. But the time for hesitation was long past. "We move at dawn," James said, his voice firm with resolve. "We gather everything we can and we bring it to light. We're not just fighting for Celia anymore, we're fighting for everyone this system has crushed." The group nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. This wasn't just about one woman's wrongful arrest. It was about something much bigger. It was about fighting the corruption that had wormed its way into every corner of their town. It was about bringing the truth to light, no matter the cost. As the group stood and began to prepare for their next move, James couldn't help but feel a rush of determination. The world they were stepping into was dark, and there was no guarantee they would come out unscathed. But as he looked at the faces of his allies, faces filled with the same resolve, the same belief in justice, he knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was enough to carry them forward. As they made their final preparations, James's mind was made up. They would take the fight to the heart of Tumbleweed Ridge, no matter the cost. And with that thought, they crossed the threshold of the cabin and stepped into the unknown, where truth and redemption awaited them if they were willing to risk everything to find it. The town square had always been the heart of Tumbleweed Ridge, its cobblestone streets worn smooth by the footsteps of townsfolk who had come to rely on the illusion of civility that the square provided. But today the square was a battleground, a place where the brittle veneer of order was about to shatter. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden haze across the town, but the air was thick with anticipation, crackling with the energy of what was to come. James McCall stood near the old fountain, the sound of its water cascading a sharp contrast to the tense silence that gripped the streets. His hand rested on the handle of his revolver, the cool metal comforting against his palm. Behind him stood his small, trusted group of allies, Hank, Tom, and Riley, each of them prepared for what they knew would be the fight of their lives. They had planned carefully, moving in shadows, gathering the evidence they needed to expose the conspiracy. Now they stood on the precipice, facing down the men and women who had manipulated the town for far too long. Blake, the mayor, and their other conspirators had no idea what was coming. James's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was firm. He was here for one reason: to rescue Celia, to right the wrongs that had been done, and to bring justice to the town he had once believed in. But as the evening air grew heavy with the sounds of approaching footsteps, he knew that there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever, and if they failed, the consequences would be dire. "I'll take the east side," Hank said, his voice low but steady. He'd been around long enough to know how these things went, and he was prepared to do whatever was necessary. "You two stick close. We'll hit them hard, and we'll hit them fast." Tom nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his own gun. Riley was already scanning the perimeter, his sharp eyes darting between the shadows. James turned to face them, his gaze meeting each of theirs in turn. "Remember why we're doing this. We're fighting for Celia, for the truth. Whatever happens, we stick together." The men nodded in unison, each of them understanding the gravity of the moment. They weren't just fighting for a single life, they were fighting to take down a system that had failed them all. As the conspirators began to filter into the square, their figures emerging from the shadows, James's pulse quickened. The town square was now their arena, and the battle was about to begin. Sir Julian Blake, the mastermind of it all, stepped forward, flanked by the mayor and a few of their loyal thugs. His face was a mask of calculated arrogance, his eyes scanning the square with an almost casual detachment. "Sheriff McCall," Blake said, his voice smooth as silk but tinged with a threatening undertone. "I knew you couldn't stay out of it. But let me make one thing clear: you've lost this fight. There's no turning back now." James didn't flinch. His hand remained steady on his revolver, his voice cold. "You've gone too far, Blake. You think you can control this town, but you're wrong. This ends today." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Blake's lips curled into a smirk, his gaze flickering to the men behind James. "You think a few old soldiers and a sheriff can stop what's been years in the making? You're nothing but pawns in a game you don't even understand." Before James could respond, the first shots rang out sharp, sudden, and deafening. The battle had begun. Gunfire echoed across the square as both sides exchanged fire, the sound of it reverberating off the walls of the buildings. James's heart raced as he moved quickly, his mind focused only on the task at hand, getting Celia to safety. His allies fought bravely, keeping the conspirators pinned down, but James's eyes were on the prize Celia, who was still in the hands of those who would do anything to silence her. He darted through the chaos, his breath coming in short bursts as he moved with purpose. He had one goal now: to get to her before it was too late. In the distance he saw her. She was standing near the edge of the square, her arms bound, her head held high despite the situation. She had been waiting, perhaps hoping, for someone to come. And now, there he was. James's pulse raced as he sprinted toward her, dodging the line of fire as best he could. He reached her just as one of the conspirators, a burly man who had been guarding her, turned to face him. James didn't hesitate. He was already in motion, his hand drawing the revolver from his belt, and in a single, fluid movement, he fired. The shot hit the man square in the chest, and he crumpled to the ground with a grunt. James didn't spare him a second glance. He grabbed Celia's bound hands and pulled her toward him, his voice urgent and low. "We need to move now," he said, his hands trembling as he worked to free her. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background. There was nothing but the two of them in that moment, her fear, his determination, the urgency of the situation. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew you'd come for me." He helped her to her feet, his hand at her back, guiding her through the chaos as the gunfire continued to crackle in the air around them. They had no time to waste. Suddenly a figure stepped into their path. Blake. He was standing tall, his expression a mixture of fury and triumph. "You think you can take her? You think you can stop this?" His voice was a low growl as he advanced on them. James's hand was already on the trigger, but it was Celia who spoke first, her voice sharp and steady despite everything. "You've already lost," she said, her gaze unwavering. "This town belongs to the people, not to men like you." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between James and Blake was thick with tension, the past and present colliding in a single moment. And then, the silence was shattered by the sound of more shots, this time from behind James. Hank and Tom emerged from the shadows, their guns raised, the conspirators now subdued by the overwhelming force of justice that had finally come for them. Blake's face twisted with rage as he realized the tide had turned. His shoulders slumped, and he reached for his gun, but it was too late. James was already there, his hand firm on Blake's arm, twisting it behind him as the others moved in. "Don't bother," James said quietly, his voice cold as ice. "It's over." With the evidence they had gathered and the conspirators in custody, the town square slowly returned to silence, the weight of the battle settling over the square like a thick fog. James stood tall, his chest heaving with exertion, as he looked down at the defeated men who had once held the reins of power in Tumbleweed Ridge. The fight was won. But the war had only just begun. As the conspirators were taken away, James turned to Celia, his eyes softening as he reached for her hand. "It's over, Celia. They won't hurt you again." Her gaze met his, filled with gratitude and something deeper, a quiet understanding of everything they had just been through. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking as she squeezed his hand. "You saved me." For a moment, the weight of the past lifted, and all that remained was the promise of a future, one where justice, however hard won, had finally found its place in Tumbleweed Ridge. But as they walked away from the wreckage of the square, James knew this was just the beginning of a long road. The town had been forever changed, but so had he, and for the first time in a long while, James McCall felt a sense of hope that, maybe, the law could still be a force for good. But only if it was wielded by men and women who were willing to fight for it. The town hall, once a symbol of authority and order, now felt like a place of reckoning. The polished wood floors that had seen so many civic gatherings, so many official proclamations, seemed to groan beneath the weight of the truth about to be revealed. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, bathing the room in a soft golden light, as though the very heavens were bearing witness to the events unfolding within these walls. The air was thick with anticipation, a strange stillness settling over the room as townsfolk gathered to witness the final showdown, the unveiling of a conspiracy that had plagued Tumbleweed Ridge for far too long. The walls, once adorned with symbols of law and order, now felt like silent witnesses to the tumultuous storm of emotions brewing inside every person present. At the front of the room stood James McCall, his back straight, his face set in grim determination. He had never imagined he would find himself here, standing before the very people he had sworn to protect, holding the fate of the town in his hands. But today was different. Today the truth would be laid bare. Celia stood beside him, her posture regal yet humble, her eyes unwavering as she faced the crowd. Her hands, though still trembling slightly from the ordeal she had endured, were clasped in front of her, a symbol of her quiet strength. She had come through hell, but now she was about to reclaim her honor and with it, her place in this town. The room was full, the townspeople murmuring amongst themselves, their voices a mixture of curiosity, disbelief and guilt. For too long they had turned a blind eye to the corruption that had seeped into every corner of their community, too afraid to confront the men who had held them all in their grip. But now there was no denying it, the truth had come crashing down like a tidal wave, and the tide of justice was sweeping through the room. James cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Ladies and gentlemen of Tumbleweed Ridge," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We are gathered here today because of the actions of a few men who thought they could control this town. Men who thought they could manipulate the law for their own gain. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. It's time for us to face what's been done and to make things right." He stepped forward and the room fell silent. James held up the sealed documents that had once been the evidence against Delia, now the very key to exposing the corruption that had led to her wrongful arrest. The documents trembled slightly in his hand, but his grip was firm. "Celia Harper has been wronged," James continued, his voice rising with conviction. "She has been framed for a crime she did not commit. And today we will clear her name and expose those who sought to destroy her." With a swift motion, James opened the documents, revealing the damning evidence that had been gathered: testimonies from informants, secret meetings between the conspirators, and the financial records that tied Blake, the mayor, and others to the scheme. The townspeople gasped as the truth was laid bare before them, and James saw the weight of their guilt settle on their shoulders. Some looked away, unable to meet his gaze, while others hung their heads in shame. Blake, the once powerful landowner, and the mayor stood at the back of the room, their faces pale and drawn, the realization that their web of lies had unraveled crashing over them like a thunderstorm. Their power had always been built on secrecy, on manipulating the truth to suit their needs. But now it was all out in the open. "You thought you could bury the truth, but you were wrong," James said, his voice sharp with fury. "You thought you could break a woman for the sake of your own gain. But this town will no longer tolerate the corruption that has festered for too long." The room was electric with tension. And then Celia spoke. "They will answer for what they've done," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the room with a calm, unwavering strength. "But the people of this town deserve better. We all deserve better than to live in fear of those who think they can control us." The townsfolk were silent, but their faces had begun to change. The guilt was still there, but now there was a glimmer of something else: hope, perhaps, or maybe the first flickers of change. They were witnessing the dawn of something new, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The conspirators were escorted out of the room, their faces filled with a mixture of rage and regret. But their power was gone, and with it, the stranglehold they had once held over Tumbleweed Ridge. As the room slowly began to disperse, James and Celia remained at the front, their eyes meeting in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The silence between them was thick with everything they had been through: the pain, the betrayal, and the unspoken bond that had grown between them. James approached her, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. "I'm sorry, Celia, for everything. I should have believed you from the start." Celia looked up at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "You did what you thought was right. But now, we've both seen how easy it is to lose sight of what matters most." He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I failed you, but I'll never fail you again." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their past struggles pressing on them, but the promise of the future burning bright between them. This was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, still a town to rebuild, still trust to be earned. But for the first time in a long while, James felt like he could finally breathe again. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James stood alone outside, looking out over the town. The last remnants of daylight bathed the streets in a soft amber glow. The town was different now, changed. The shadows of corruption had been cast aside, and for the first time in a long while, James felt hope rise in his chest. He had made mistakes, yes, But now he had the chance to make things right, not just for Celia, but for the town he had sworn to protect. And as he turned back toward the town hall, where Celia waited, he knew that the journey ahead would be long, but it would be one they would take together. The first light of a new day was on the horizon, and with it, the promise of redemption, of reconciliation, and of a future built on truth and justice. The first light of dawn broke over Tumbleweed Ridge like a soft sigh, the mist lifting from the fields as the day began to stir with quiet promise. The town, still recovering from the chaos that had shattered its false sense of order, was bathed in a golden hue, the air cool and crisp, as if the land itself was taking a deep breath after the storm had passed. James McCall rode alone along the narrow trail that wound through the outskirts of town, his horse's hooves making a soft rhythm against the earth. The valley stretched before him, the rolling hills dotted with patches of green, the sky above a canvas of soft pinks and purples as the sun slowly rose. It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning that whispered of new beginnings. And yet, James's heart was heavy with the weight of the changes he had seen, and the ones still to come. He had been a man defined by the law, rigid, unyielding. His entire life had been built on a foundation of duty, of black and white rules that left no room for ambiguity. But now, as he rode through the peaceful landscape, the sharp contrasts of his former life and his new reality became painfully clear. The law was no longer enough. The truth had demanded a different kind of justice, one that could bend and flex, one that could reach beyond the cold confines of the rules and touch the human heart. He could no longer see the world in the same way. The town, the people, Celia had opened his eyes to the complexity of what it meant to truly serve and protect. He had always believed that justice was about punishment, about right and wrong, but he had come to realize that sometimes the right choice wasn't the easiest one. His mind wandered back to those early days, to the man he had been before everything had changed. The sheriff who had looked at the world through a narrow lens, unable to see the gray areas, unable to imagine the possibility of redemption. How different that man seemed now. How far he had come since the day he had first met Celia, the woman whose strength had challenged everything he had ever believed in. James slowed his horse, pausing at the crest of a hill. Below him, the town seemed peaceful, the smoke from chimneys curling into the morning air. The distant hum of life was faint, but it was their hope rising with the sun, just as it had for him. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. There was still much to be done. The wounds of the past would take time to heal, the scars of corruption not easily erased. But for the first time in his life, James felt a quiet certainty that the road ahead would be different. He was no longer just a sheriff. He was a man willing to fight for something more, something that went beyond laws and rules. As he turned his horse back toward the town, he saw Celia waiting for him by the edge of a slow-moving stream that wound its way through the valley. Her silhouette was framed by the soft glow of the rising sun, her face turned toward the water, her expression one of quiet contemplation. The sight of her, standing there in the peace of the morning, brought a surge of warmth to his chest. He dismounted and walked toward her, the sound of his boots against the earth barely audible in the stillness of the morning. Celia turned as he approached, her eyes meeting his with a softness that spoke of understanding, of shared experiences and unspoken promises. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the world they had both endured and overcome. James nodded, taking a moment to appreciate the scene before him, the way the light danced on the water, the birds singing their morning songs, the world so still and full of life. For a moment, everything felt right. "It is," he agreed. "It feels like a new beginning." Celia's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his. "We've both had our share of darkness," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "And the road hasn't been easy, but we've come through it together. And that means something. It means we have a chance to build something lasting, something real." James's heart clenched as he looked at her, this woman who had fought for her freedom, who had never once given up on the truth. even when the world had turned against her. She was everything he had never thought he needed, and everything he now realized he couldn't live without. "We'll rebuild this town," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll make it a place where justice means something, where people don't have to fear those in power." "I've learned that the law can't fix everything, Celia. It needs to be more than just rules. It needs to have heart. It needs to have compassion." She smiled then, a soft, understanding smile that lit up her face, as if she knew the depth of what he was saying. "We've both learned that lesson the hard way," she said. "But now we have the chance to create something better, together." They stood there for a long moment, the sound of the stream flowing beside them, the world around them still and peaceful. And for the first time, James felt at peace with himself, with the choices he had made, and with the woman by his side. He had always believed in duty, in the unbending rules of the law. But now he understood that true justice wasn't just about right and wrong, it was about redemption, about giving people the chance to heal, to grow, to become better than they had been. Celia took his hand in hers, her fingers warm against his. "We can't change the past, James," she said softly, "but we can build a future, one where love and justice go hand in hand." James squeezed her hand, a surge of gratitude rising in his chest. "And we'll make it happen," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. Together. As they stood there, hand in hand, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the valley below. The world, like them, was still healing, still finding its way. But in that moment James McCall knew that he was ready for whatever came next. He had found his purpose, his true purpose, and he would face it with Celia by his side. The future was theirs to shape, and for the first time the promise of a new day felt real. A day where love, justice, and hope could grow together, side by side. And in the quiet of that new dawn, they knew that no matter the challenges ahead, they would face them together. Several months had passed since the storm had swept through Tumbleweed Ridge, and though the town had been changed by the events that had unfolded, the healing was well underway. The once dusty streets had begun to hum with the energy of renewal. Construction had started on new buildings, the foundations of hope rising alongside the brick and timber. The town square, once a place of tension and whispered fear, now held the bustle of life once more, children laughing as they ran through the open spaces where shadows once clung. At the town hall, the atmosphere was vastly different. A town council meeting was taking place, and for the first time in a long while, the air was thick with honest conversation rather than hidden agendas. The townsfolk, once divided by fear and suspicion, now gathered to discuss the future plans for infrastructure, schools, and the justice system that had once failed them, but was now slowly rebuilding itself on a foundation of integrity. There was still much to be done, but the promise of a fresh start was evident in every small moment. People greeted one another with a sense of community, shaking hands, exchanging ideas, and speaking openly about their hopes for the future. James McCall stood near the back of the room, his arms crossed and his gaze distant. The proceedings felt different now, calmer, more deliberate. The weight of his badge no longer felt like a burden, but a responsibility he shared with the people around him. He had long ago come to understand that justice was not an absolute force, it was a living, breathing thing, shaped by the choices of the people who carried it forward. And while the past would never be fully erased, the future was his to shape. He had learned, through hard lessons and painful experiences, that true justice wasn't about rigid laws, it was about compassion, understanding, and the willingness to see things as they truly were. He had questioned his oaths, his duty, and his own worth, but in the end, those questions had led him to a deeper understanding of the world. Celia, too, had found her place in the world again. She was no longer the woman who had been trapped by false accusations, the woman who had fought merely to survive. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her future. She was now actively involved in the town's growth, leading efforts to rebuild the community, and even learning new trades to support herself and the future she was determined to build. Celia had found her footing once again, and in doing so had helped others reclaim theirs as well. James watched as Celia spoke with a small group of women, her expression focused but warm as she gestured toward plans for a new marketplace. She had never been one to dwell in the shadows of her past, and in the months since her name had been cleared, she had stepped into the light with the kind of grace and strength James had come to admire. She noticed him then, her eyes meeting his from across the room. Her smile was quiet, understanding a smile that told him everything he needed to know. They had both come so far, and the road ahead was still long, but they would walk it together. Later that evening, as the sun sank low in the sky, casting a soft amber light over the town, James stood outside, his hand resting on the fence at the edge of the town. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the past. He had been a man of rigid laws, unwavering in his belief that the law was the answer to everything. But now he understood that the truth was more complex, more delicate than he had ever imagined. He had sacrificed so much his sense of certainty, his former beliefs, his heart to find the man he was now. The road had not been easy, and there were scars both inside and out that would never fully heal. But he had come to accept those scars as part of who he was. They were reminders of the choices he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the man he had become. There would be moments of doubt, of course, but he had come to understand that redemption was a journey, not a destination, and every day offered a new opportunity to take one more step. He was pulled from his thoughts by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Celia standing there, her figure outlined by the dimming light. She looked every bit the woman who had fought for her freedom, but there was something else in her eyes now, something more. "I thought I might find you out here," she said, her voice soft but full of warmth. James smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached all the way to his heart. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice quiet, "about everything we've been through, about how far we've come." She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. "We've come a long way, James. But there's still more to be done." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words in the pit of his stomach. "I know. But for the first time, I feel like we can face whatever comes next." She took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together," she said, her voice steady. "And I believe in what we're building, in what we can build together. Together." The words settled over him like a warm embrace. He had never truly understood the power of that word until now, until he had stood beside her and watched her rebuild herself, watched her reclaim the life that had once been stolen from her. James looked out over the town, his gaze settling on the horizon where the first light of dawn would soon break. The town, like him, was still healing, still finding its way. But the journey ahead was one they would take together, with hope and love guiding them forward. As he turned to face Celia, he felt a new sense of peace settle in his chest. The shadows of their past would always be there, lingering just beneath the surface. But the light had come, and with it, a new day, one filled with possibilities, with redemption, and with love. And as the two of them stood there, hand in hand, watching the sky slowly brighten, James knew that the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Together. The sun rose higher, casting its warm light over the town as the promise of a new day, one filled with hope, redemption, and renewal, began to take shape. And as they rode out of town, side by side, the shadows of their past receded behind them, replaced by the light of a future they would build together. The road ahead was theirs, and with each new dawn, the world would be a little brighter. For Minnie.